Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. The first night after my son's wedding, I plugged in an old baby monitor I had kept for decades. I thought it would bring me comfort, a small habit from the years when Daniel was a child. Instead, it shattered my world. Through the static came Claire's laughter, sharp and cruel, as she whispered to another man that she had only married my son to steal my $7 million home. She called me the old woman as if I were already erased. My name is Mara Hayes, and in that moment I realized I was no longer just a mother or a widow. I was a woman standing at the edge of a battle I never asked for but could no longer avoid. The night was quiet except for the faint hum of crickets outside the window. I sat at the edge of my bed in my house in Bellevue, Washington, the same house I had lived in for more than 40 years, the house my late husband's family had passed down, and which was now worth nearly $7 million. That number never mattered to me until recently. To me, this house was memory carved into wood and stone, a place where every version of my life had unfolded, where I raised my son Daniel, where I learned to live again after becoming a widow. That night, though, the house felt different. It was the first night after Daniel's wedding. I still had dishes stacked in the sink from the small reception we had hosted in the backyard. The scent of lemon cake lingered in the kitchen, clinging stubbornly to the air. I should have been happy, or at least relieved, that my son had found someone to share his life with. Instead, there was a weight pressing against my chest, an unease I could not explain. Earlier that evening, his new wife Claire had walked into my living room with her suitcase and simply rolled it over the threshold. No conversation about where she and Daniel would live, no hesitation, no courtesy pause. Just the sound of wheels clicking across the wood floor as if the house had already become hers. Daniel had smiled at me, tired but content, and kissed my cheek. I forced myself to smile back. He deserved his happiness, or at least he thought he had found it. I had gone upstairs to rest when I remembered the old baby monitor. It had been sitting forgotten in a drawer for years, one of those things mothers keep long after their children have grown. Claire had complained that the walls were thin, and she did not want Daniel overhearing conversations when they needed privacy. Her voice had carried a sweetness when she said it, but I saw the flicker in her eyes. Something about the request stayed with me. I plugged the monitor in by habit, curious more than anything else, the way a person sometimes holds onto old habits without reason. The soft hiss of static filled the room, and then like a knife sliding through silence, I heard laughter. It was Claire's. Light, sharp, amused. My hands froze around the teacup I had been holding. The tea sloshed over the rim, burning my skin, but I did not move. I could hear her voice as if she were standing right beside me. I married him for this house. That was the first sentence. The old woman has no idea what's coming. Just give me time to wrap it all up. The teacup slipped from my hand onto the nightstand, the liquid spreading like a stain across the wood. My heart pounded so loudly I was afraid it would drown out her words. I sat perfectly still, afraid that if I breathed too loudly, I might miss something. Another voice came through, deeper, male. I did not recognize it, but I knew instantly it was not my son. Claire's tone softened when she spoke to him, teasing, almost giddy. She told him she had only married Daniel for the house, that she could play the role of the dutiful wife long enough to get what she wanted. My knees felt weak. I pressed my palms flat against the quilt just to steady myself. All the small gestures of kindness I had believed in flashed through my mind. The afternoons we spent sewing the hem of her dress together. The way she had kissed my cheek at the rehearsal dinner, perfume too strong, but her smile seemingly genuine. Every little act I had taken as proof of warmth collapsed into something hollow. I realized I had been welcoming a mask into my life. I rose slowly from the bed and walked into the hallway. The walls seemed longer, the light dimmer, as if I were walking through someone else's home. My feet carried me into the bathroom, and I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked pale, older than I had felt just an hour ago. From the monitor still resting on the dresser, her voice cut through again. The old woman. That was what she called me. Not Mara, not Mom, not even Daniel's mother. Just the old woman. Each syllable landed like a stone. I gripped the counter, my knuckles white, my breath shallow. I thought of Daniel downstairs, likely smiling in his sleep, oblivious to the knife at his back. He trusted her, believed she was his safe place. I wanted to run into his room, to shake him awake, to tell him what I had heard. But I stood there frozen because I knew he would not believe me, not yet. The sound of Claire's laughter still echoed through the static, so sure, so confident, as if she already owned everything that was mine. I returned to my bedroom and sat at the edge of the mattress, hands folded in my lap. The jasmine outside the window should have smelled sweet, but to me it was sour heavy with something I could not name. I did not cry. I did not scream. I sat in stillness, every beat of my heart loud and deliberate. I had lived long enough to recognize when something had broken that could not be put back together. I thought of my husband gone these many years and wondered what he would say if he were here. He had built his life around this home, sacrificed for it, cared for it. And now his legacy was nothing more than a prize to someone who had smiled in our photographs. The night stretched on. I listened to the soft creaks of the house, the way the wood shifted with the cooling air. For decades, those sounds had been comforting. Tonight they sounded like warnings, whispers of danger that lived under the same roof as me. When the voices faded and only static remained, I finally reached over and turned off the monitor. The silence was heavier than the noise had been. I placed the small receiver back on the dresser and rested my hand on it for a long moment. Something in me had shifted. I could feel it, quiet but undeniable. I knew from that moment forward I could no longer look at Claire as family. She was something else entirely. She was a trespasser cloaked as a daughter-in-law. I lay back on the bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling until dawn began to filter through the curtains. Sleep never came. What I had heard could not be unheard. What I had seen in myself could not be undone. And for the first time in years, I realized I was no longer simply a mother or a widow. I was a woman standing at the edge of a battle she had never asked for, but could no longer avoid. The morning after the wedding, the house already felt different. The faint scent of flowers and food from the reception lingered in the air, but it was quickly replaced by the shuffle of boxes and the scrape of a suitcase rolling across the wood floor. Claire did not ask where she should put her things. She simply claimed space, moving her belongings into corners I had kept for decades. Daniel smiled at her as if it was the most natural thing in the world, as if this house had always belonged to the two of them. I pressed my lips together and kept quiet, carrying the last tray of dishes into the kitchen. The curtains in the living room had always been blue with small embroidered flowers. I had sewn them years ago when Daniel was a boy, stitching late into the night with a lamp on the table and the radio playing softly. That morning, I found them folded on the chair by the door, replaced with white sheer fabric that made the room look colder. Claire said she thought the new curtains let in more light. Daniel kissed her on the forehead and told her it looked beautiful. I swallowed the lump in my throat and carried the old curtains upstairs, pressing the fabric to my chest as I climbed the steps. The days that followed brought small changes, one after another. The record player that had belonged to my husband was lifted out of the living room and set in the garage. The cushions that had softened the wooden chairs vanished without a word. The old lamp with its yellow fringe, a gift from my mother when I first moved in, disappeared one afternoon. When I asked Claire if she had seen it, she shrugged and said it did not match the room anymore. Daniel hardly noticed. His work at the rehabilitation center consumed his time, and when he was home, he was exhausted. He smiled at her, leaned into her warmth, and never questioned why things looked different. I tried to tell myself I was being too sensitive. Maybe every new wife wants to shape her space. Maybe the old pieces meant nothing to her, and maybe I was clinging too tightly to what was gone. Still, I felt the house shifting under my feet, losing the texture of memory replaced with something smooth and unfamiliar. One afternoon, I went to dust the mantel where I always kept a framed photograph. It was of Daniel at 5 years old, holding a stick like a sword, while my husband laughed in the background. The spot was empty. My heart raced as I searched the room. I checked drawers, the bookshelf under piles of magazines. Nothing. Later that evening, while straightening the guest room, I noticed the frame lying under the bed, its glass cracked in the corner. I lifted it carefully, running my thumb over my husband's smiling face. For a moment, I could hardly breathe. It was not an accident. It had been placed there. At dinner that night, I served roasted chicken and potatoes. Daniel complimented the meal between stories about a patient who had finally managed to walk again. Claire laughed at his jokes and poured wine into his glass. I watched her movements, graceful and deliberate, the way she leaned into him, the way she smiled at him as if I were invisible. When I cleared the plates, she thanked me with a sweetness that rang hollow. Later, alone in the kitchen, I ran hot water over the dishes and felt the sting in my chest deepen. The photo frame was hidden under a bed, the curtains were replaced, the lamp gone, the cushions vanished. These were not coincidences. These were erasures. Each piece removed was a part of my life, of Daniel's childhood, of the marriage I had lost. I could see what she was doing, even if Daniel could not. I began to watch more carefully. Claire hosted 2 of her friends that week, leading them through the house like a tour guide. She referred to the rooms as our home, describing plans to open the kitchen, to tear down walls, to repaint. She did not look at me as she spoke. I stood in the corner, a presence no more important than the furniture. Her friends nodded politely, and Claire's smile stretched wide. That night, I lay awake listening to the floorboards creak as they always had, but instead of comfort, they sounded like sighs, like the house itself was unsettled. I thought about what I had heard on the monitor, the way she had called me the old woman. Now I saw the words shaping themselves in the walls around me. She was erasing me piece by piece, removing me from the very home I had protected through winters when I could barely afford heating, through years when I chose groceries carefully so the mortgage would always be paid. Daniel remained blind to it all. His days stretched from early morning until late evening. When he returned, he carried the exhaustion of healing other people's bodies. He saw only the smile Claire gave him, not the shadows behind it. I tried to tell myself he deserved his peace, that he had worked hard enough to earn it, but I could not ignore what I saw. One evening, I set the blue floral curtains on my lap and ran my hand along the stitches. The thread had loosened in places, the fabric worn thin, but they were mine. I whispered softly to myself that I would not let them be forgotten. When I went upstairs to place them back in storage, I passed by the guest room again. The photo frame I had hidden away earlier was no longer under the bed where I had left it. Someone had moved it. I opened the closet and found it pushed behind a box of winter coats. My hands trembled as I pulled it free. The cracked glass caught the light, and I saw my son's small face smiling up at me. My husband's laughter frozen behind him. I held the photo against my chest and sat on the edge of the bed. The silence of the house pressed in heavy and sharp. For the first time since Daniel's wedding, I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth. Claire was not building a life with my son. She was dismantling the life I had already lived. I placed the frame gently on the nightstand in my own room and stared at it until my eyes blurred. The pieces she had hidden, the things she had thrown aside, they were not just objects. They were warnings. Each one told me to stay alert, to prepare myself to understand that this was no longer about old curtains or broken lamps. It was about my place in the house I had fought to keep, the house that was more than walls and floors, the house that was my history. And as I sat there listening to the soft murmur of voices drifting up from Daniel and Claire's room, I knew I had to hold on to every detail. She was erasing the past in daylight, but I had seen enough to know she was planning something far greater in the shadows. I stood for a long time, holding the cracked frame, the weight of it heavy in my hands, before I finally set it back on my nightstand. The unease that had started with the monitor was now rooted deep in me. Every small change Claire made was no longer harmless. It was deliberate. If she was willing to throw away memories, she was willing to go further. That night I decided I would not wait to be erased. The next morning, I pulled the baby monitor out of the drawer where I had stuffed it. The plastic was yellowed from years of neglect, and the cord was stiff, but it still worked. I dug through a kitchen drawer until I found fresh batteries and replaced the corroded ones. The moment the little red light flickered on, I felt something shift inside me. This forgotten object was about to become my first line of defense. I placed the receiver in my bedroom, hidden behind a stack of old novels, and moved the transmitter downstairs near the den where Claire liked to sit with her phone. I told Daniel I was organizing old things, and he nodded distractedly while tying his shoes for work. He barely noticed what I carried in my hands. After he left, I went to the bathroom. Dust clung to the rafters and the air smelled of cedar. I pulled open an old wooden trunk, the one I had not touched since my husband passed. Inside were cassette tapes, dozens of them labeled in his handwriting. Recordings of Daniel playing piano as a boy, old radio broadcasts he had saved, even letters read aloud into a microphone when we could not be together. My throat tightened as I held the tapes, but I realized they could serve a new purpose. If anyone questioned the equipment I had around the house, I could say I was preserving his old recordings. It was a story that made sense. I set up the old cassette deck in my study, wiping away years of dust. The reels still spun, the sound still came through the speakers. The comfort of that familiar click and whir steadied me. Beneath that noise, I could conceal what I truly intended to record. I ordered a few small microphones online, the kind that looked like nothing more than little black buttons. When the package arrived 2 days later, I signed for it quickly before Claire could intercept it. I waited until she went out with friends and then slipped each one into its hiding place. Behind the stack of books in the living room above the kitchen cabinet tucked into the frame of the hallway mirror, I tested each one, my breath catching when I heard the faint echo of my own voice through the headphones. For days I moved carefully, blending into the rhythm of the house cleaning counters, folding laundry, humming softly as if everything were normal. Claire drifted from room to room with her phone in hand, her tone bright when Daniel was near and clipped when she thought I was not listening. What she did not know was that the house itself was listening now. It was late on a Thursday evening when the first words came through clear enough to shatter what little hope I had left. Daniel was upstairs finishing charts for work, his door closed. I sat in the study with the cassette deck running. Through the headphones, Claire's voice rose sharp and impatient. She was on the phone pacing the kitchen. "I cannot keep waiting," she said, her voice low but steady. "We need doctor Ellis to come sooner. She is starting to get in the way." My stomach clenched. The voice on the other end was muffled but male. Claire lowered hers further. "I will tell him she has been confused leaving things on the stove forgetting names. He has done this before. Once he files his report, it is just paperwork. Daniel will sign anything I put in front of him." The blood drained from my face. She was not only trying to erase me from the house, she wanted to erase me from myself. To have me declared unfit, incapable, stripped of every right I still held. I pressed my hand to the desk to steady myself, my nails biting into the wood. I let the tape run longer. Claire laughed softly, almost tenderly. "Do not worry," she said to the man on the line. "I will take care of everything." The conversation ended and the room around me seemed to tilt. I tore the headphones off and sat in silence, the only sound the faint hiss of the tape. My reflection in the window looked pale, but there was a fire in my eyes I had not seen in years. Later that night, I heard Claire humming as she brushed her teeth in the bathroom. She passed me in the hall with a casual smile. "You are still up, Mara. Try to get some sleep." I nodded, forcing my lips into something that resembled a smile, but inside I was trembling with fury. She thought she was clever, thought I was blind and tired and too old to notice. But I had her words now caught on tape, wrapped tightly in magnetic ribbon that could not be unwound. I lay awake until dawn, the recorder still spinning on the desk. I listened again and again, each time hearing the certainty in her voice, the way she plotted to use Daniel's trust as a weapon. With every replay, the sting of betrayal cut deeper, but so did my resolve. The house that night felt alive in a new way. The beams groaned, the floor creaked, but to me they were not warnings anymore. They were witnesses. I whispered into the quiet that I would not be erased. Not from this house, not from my life. When the sun rose, light spilling across the kitchen floor, I poured myself a cup of coffee with hands that no longer trembled. Claire came down an hour later, her hair brushed smooth, her smile sweet as honey. She asked if I wanted toast. I told her no, my voice steady. She did not know what I carried in my drawer, what I had heard in the night, and she did not know that for the first time since her laughter cut through that monitor, I felt the strength of something unshakable returning to me. The days that followed felt like walking across ice that grew thinner with every step. I carried on with my chores, cooking meals, sweeping the porch, watering the hydrangeas by the fence, but behind every movement I listened. I left the recorder hidden and the microphones quietly working. When Daniel came home tired from his long shifts at the clinic, I smiled at him and asked about his patients. He never noticed the tension that clung to the walls when Claire's phone lit up in the other room. One evening, while folding laundry in the upstairs hall, I heard her voice again, low and hurried. The sound carried just enough through the monitor I had set behind the books. She was pacing the floorboards, creaked with each turn. I caught my breath and leaned closer to the faint static. "I told you," she whispered, her tone edged with annoyance. Ellis will finish the evaluation Daniel will sign, and the house will be ours before summer is over. The man's voice, deep and impatient, answered, "You keep saying that, Claire, but I am tired of waiting. I need results." She laughed softly, the sound hollow. "Be patient, Vic. You know how trusting he is. He would sign his own paycheck over to me if I asked. Once Ellis files the paperwork, nothing can stop us." I pressed my hand to my mouth, my heart thudding slow and hard. There it was, clear and undeniable. She was promising my son's trust, offering it like currency, while this man pushed for urgency. They spoke about my house as if I were already gone, a ghost, in the very rooms I still occupied. When the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table in the dark and opened the notebook I had pulled from the drawer earlier that day. I wrote the date, the time, the voices I heard, the exact words as best I could recall. I underlined their names and drew a box around the phrase she used, "The house will be ours." The pen dug into the paper, leaving grooves that scraped through to the next page. That notebook became my shield. Each morning after my coffee, I carried it with me, slipping it into the pocket of my cardigan. Whenever I overheard something, however small, I wrote it down. If Claire moved a document from one drawer to another, if she used my phone when she thought I was napping, if she whispered into her own with her back turned, I logged it. I felt almost clinical in my detail, the way I had once taken notes when helping my husband pay bills. Except this time, it was not survival through winter, but survival in my own home. On a quiet Tuesday, I came downstairs earlier than usual and found Claire in the kitchen. She was leaning against the counter, speaking quickly into her phone. I stopped at the top of the stairs, keeping to the shadows, my breath held tight. "I spoke to Reed already," she said, tapping her nails on the counter. "He understands it has to be discreet. It is just a soft listing for now, nothing public. Once the paperwork is finalized, we can push it live." Her friend on the line asked something I could not hear, but Claire's reply was sharp. "No, she has no idea. She thinks I am reorganizing the pantry. Reed says the market is hot. This house could go for more than 7. The air left my lungs in a rush. My hands trembled on the banister as I steadied myself. She was not only planning to strip me of my rights, but was already speaking to a real estate agent about selling the house. My house. The one I had repaired roof shingles on during storms, the one where Daniel's first piano recital had been played on the upright in the den, the one that held every laugh and every fight of our marriage. I stepped back silently, careful not to make the floor creak. In my room, I closed the door and pulled out my notebook. My handwriting came jagged this time. The ink smudged as I wrote Reed Allen's name, circled it, and added arrows toward the words "soft listing." It was no longer just conversation. This was action. Later that night, I joined Daniel and Claire for dinner. Daniel spoke about a patient making progress with a new therapy. Claire smiled brightly and poured him more wine. She turned to me and asked if I had considered new curtains for the upstairs hall, as if the topic of the house was nothing more than decoration. I looked at her carefully, every ounce of my composure pressed into that single glance, and told her I preferred things the way they were. She shrugged and looked away, but I saw the flicker in her eyes, the faint shadow of irritation that betrayed her mask. Daniel remained oblivious, chatting about his shift, unaware that his wife had already put the first lines on a sales plan for the house he grew up in. When the table was cleared and the dishes stacked, I slipped into the study and checked the tape again. Her voice rang clear, her words etched into magnetic ribbon. I labeled the tape carefully with the date and tucked it into a box beneath older cassettes. My notebook lay open beside it, the ink still drying on the page. The house was no longer simply mine to protect. It had become a stage where every whisper was evidence and every action part of a plan. I pressed my hand against the old wooden desk, steadying the fury inside me. She thought I would fade quietly, that I was too old, too fragile, too forgetful to notice. She was wrong. That night, I placed the notebook on the nightstand beside the cracked photo of Daniel and his father. As I turned off the lamp, I whispered to the photograph what I could not say aloud to anyone else. I will not let her win. The silence of the house pressed around me, but for the first time it did not feel empty. It felt like a witness holding every secret she thought she had hidden. I woke the next morning with the kind of heaviness that comes from both exhaustion and certainty. The certainty was the harder part. Knowing that Claire had already reached out to an agent meant she believed her plan was unshakable. If I confronted her outright, she would only twist my words. If I tried to warn Daniel, he would look at me with that soft, tired patience of his and tell me not to worry. The only way forward was to let her show her hand completely. That meant I had to become the character she wanted me to be. The first time I acted, it was small. I set a pot of water on the stove for tea turned on the burner, then left it there while I went out to sweep the porch. 10 minutes later, the smell of scorched metal filled the kitchen. Daniel came in through the back door and furrowed his brow. "Mom, you forgot the water again." I pressed my palm to my forehead, let my face soften, and said in a quiet voice, "I must have been distracted." Claire hovered near the counter, pretending to tidy a stack of mail. I caught the way she looked at Daniel, the slight lift of her eyebrow, the flicker of satisfaction. Later that afternoon, when Daniel was at work, I took one of my old wool sweaters and folded it neatly before slipping it into the freezer, tucked between a bag of peas and a box of frozen waffles. I waited until evening when Claire went searching for ice cream. The sound of the freezer door opening was followed by a sharp pause. She pulled out the sweater slowly, her lips curling in amusement. "Mara, did you mean to put this here?" I feigned confusion, my voice light. Did I really do that? Maybe I was dreaming while I cleaned. She laughed softly, not unkind, but with the edge of someone who thought they had proof. I hated myself for every moment of it. Pretending to be less than I was letting her believe she was in control, hurt in a way I had not felt since the night I buried my husband. Still, I told myself it was temporary. Every slip I staged was another thread in the trap I was weaving for her. One morning, I walked into the kitchen wearing a slipper on my right foot and one of Daniel's old oven mitts on my left. Daniel had just come home from an overnight shift. He blinked at me in confusion, his coffee mug halfway to his lips. "Mom, what are you doing?" I lowered my eyes and said softly, "I thought I had 2 slippers." He smiled, puzzled but gentle, and shook his head. Claire, standing behind him, pressed her lips together as if to hide her glee. She pulled out her phone a few minutes later, her thumbs moving quickly across the screen. I did not need to guess who she was texting. The more I stumbled, the bolder she became. I overheard her in the hallway one evening, whispering into her phone, her voice tinged with impatience. "Only a few more times, Vic. Ellis will sign the report soon." I could hear his muffled voice, low and demanding, though I could not make out the words. Claire laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the quiet. "Trust me," she said. "She is already slipping in front of him. He will believe anything I tell him." I gripped the edge of the stair railing until my knuckles ached. That single sentence confirmed everything. She was keeping count of my mistakes, collecting them like coins in a jar, waiting to cash them in with the doctor who would write me off as incompetent. My chest burned, but I forced myself to breathe slowly to stay in character. That week, I misplaced the keys on purpose. I tucked them under the old sheet music in the piano bench and told Daniel later that I must have left them at the grocery store. He frowned but did not argue. Claire, however, made a note of it. I could almost see the satisfaction in the way she folded her arms, her smile small and victorious. Each time I played my role, I wrote it down in my notebook. I logged the burned pot, the sweater in the freezer, the mismatched shoes, the keys. I recorded the dates and the way Claire reacted. Every entry became a piece of armor proof that the confusion she was so eager to prove was not real, but staged. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I would sit in the study with the recorder and headphones replaying her words. "Only a few more times, Vic. Ellis will sign." The sound of her voice was steady, confident, convinced that I was unraveling right on schedule. I stared at the photo of Daniel as a boy on the wall above my desk, his small hands clutching that toy sword, my husband laughing beside him. I whispered to the photograph that I was still here, that I would not let her erase me. The hardest part was watching Daniel. He looked at me differently sometimes, not with suspicion, but with concern. When I fumbled or asked the same question twice, his eyes softened and he would place his hand on mine. "Mom, maybe you need more rest?" he said one evening. I smiled weakly and told him he was probably right. Claire stood in the doorway listening, her arms crossed. She did not need to speak. The look in her eyes said enough. That night I sat on the edge of my bed long after everyone had gone to sleep. The cassette tapes my husband had left me were stacked neatly on the nightstand, my notebook open beside them. I had written the day's entry in careful handwriting, but my hands trembled as I closed it. Pretending to be lost chipped away at me, but I reminded myself of what was at stake. This house was not just wood and paint. It was where my life had unfolded, where my son had grown, where my husband's memory still lingered. When the clock struck midnight, I heard Claire's footsteps in the hall, quick and hushed. She spoke in a low whisper into her phone. Only a few more times she repeated, her tone certain. "Ellis will sign the report. Daniel will sign too. The house will be ours." I sat perfectly still in the dark, my pulse steady, my notebook waiting on the nightstand. The trap was tightening, and she thought I was already caught. The house grew quieter as I sharpened my resolve. Every sound seemed sharper, every creak of the floorboards carried weight. I no longer moved through my days simply as a mother or widow, but as someone preparing for a siege. I tightened my surveillance, planting 2 more small microphones in places I knew Claire favored. One behind the framed map in the hallway, another tucked into the corner of the den where she often sat scrolling on her phone. I checked the batteries each morning and labeled the tapes with steady, careful handwriting. One Saturday afternoon, my neighbor Linda stopped me at the mailbox. She wore a worried expression as she shifted her purse on her shoulder. "Mara, do you know your daughter-in-law was outside your house late the other night?" I forced a smile and said I had been asleep, asking lightly what made her think so. Linda hesitated before explaining that her Ring camera angled toward the street had captured Claire moving around the side of the house close to midnight. She offered to send me the clip. I thanked her, heart pounding, and that evening opened the email Linda forwarded. The video played grainy but clear. There was Claire crouched near my study window, her phone flashlight glowing as she slipped inside through the unlocked door. She reappeared 15 minutes later, carrying a folder, flipping through papers before tucking them back and slipping into the house again. My skin crawled watching it. She was not waiting for me to fail, she was actively digging for evidence to create. I saved the file to a flash drive, labeled it, and tucked it beneath the pile of cassette tapes in my drawer. The house itself was becoming my ally. Every hidden microphone, every borrowed recording, every camera from the neighborhood added to the case I was quietly building. A few days later, while checking the landline for messages, I noticed a call in the log I had not made. The number was unfamiliar. I dialed it from Daniel's old flip phone I kept in the drawer. A woman answered, identifying herself as an intake officer for a regional elder care office. She said someone had called recently asking about evaluations for diminished capacity. My heart sank, but my hands steadied as I thanked her and hung up. I printed the call log that showed the number, circled it, and slipped it into my notebook. I knew with certainty I had not dialed that number. Claire had used my phone to create a trail. I could almost hear her voice rehearsing the story she would tell Ellis, how her poor, confused mother-in-law had forgotten she had even made the inquiry herself. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of me. The entries stretched back weeks now, each one a bead on a chain. Burned pot, sweater in freezer, slippers mismatched, keys hidden, Claire whispering to Vic, Reed Allen's soft listing, now the Ring video and the phone call log. The pattern was clear not just to me, but to anyone who would one day review it. She was not documenting my decline. She was fabricating it. Daniel came in late, exhausted, dropping his keys on the counter. He kissed my cheek and thanked me for leaving dinner in the oven. As he ate, Claire leaned against the counter with her phone, smiling softly. They spoke about his patients, about a colleague moving departments, and I sat silent listening to the undercurrent. Daniel's voice was steady, his smile tired, but Claire's eyes flicked toward me often, as if gauging whether I would slip again in front of him. I did not. I carried the plate to the sink and washed it slowly, my hands steady in the warm water. I let her believe she was winning, but inside, I was cataloging every move she made. Later that night, long after they had gone to bed, I played back the latest tape from the microphone hidden in the den. Her voice filled the headphones. She spoke to Vic again, quieter than usual, but still sharp. She said she had already spoken with Ellis, that he would come for an initial visit soon, and that Daniel would not question it. Vic pressed her, asking if she was sure. Claire laughed lightly and said she had already taken care of planting the signs. She mentioned the burned coffee, the misplaced keys, the call log. My stomach twisted, but I kept listening. She said, "She is harmless. Completely harmless. Ellis just needs to see it with his own eyes. A few more weeks, and the deed will be mine." I stopped the tape, removed the headphones, and sat in the dark. For the first time since this began, the fear inside me shifted into something else. Proof. Not suspicion, not paranoia, not whispers in the night. Proof that could not be erased. Proof that even in a courtroom would stand. I slipped the tape into its case, labeled it with the date, and placed it beside the flash drive with Linda's video and the printed call log. The drawer was growing heavier with evidence. The house had become a trap one Claire did not even realize she was walking into. She thought she was clever, but she underestimated the one skill I had mastered over decades of marriage, motherhood, and widowhood. I knew how to endure, how to wait, and how to notice every small thing others overlooked. As I turned out the light and settled into bed, the photo of Daniel as a child smiled faintly from the nightstand. I whispered a promise to him, though he could not hear it. I will not let her take this house. I will not let her take me. The next morning, I placed the flash drive, the cassette tapes, the call log, and my notebook into a canvas tote. My hands shook as I zipped it closed, but not from fear. It was resolve. I had been waiting and watching long enough. It was time to step outside the walls of my house and place this burden into hands that could use it. The drive to the King County Courthouse in downtown Seattle was steady and quiet. The sky hung gray with thin rain, and the wipers beat a tired rhythm against the windshield. I gripped the steering wheel, telling myself over and over that I was not losing control, I was taking it back. Inside the courthouse, the fluorescent lights were too bright, bouncing off marble floors that echoed with every step. At the clerk's office, a woman with kind eyes and silver glasses resting on a chain greeted me. She introduced herself as Grace Miller. Her voice was gentle, but I could tell she had seen enough people walk into this office with fear tucked into their coats. I slid the deed across the counter first, then the notebook pages marked with dates and underlined phrases, then the call log printout, finally the small recorder and one of the labeled tapes. My fingers lingered on the items for a moment before I let them go. Grace adjusted her glasses and looked at me carefully. "You have more than most people bring," she said softly. "Let me show this to someone who can help." She led me down a narrow hall to an office where a tall man in a gray suit was reviewing files. His tie was slightly loose, and he had the weary patience of someone used to hearing too many stories of exploitation. He stood as Grace introduced him as Cal Parker, liaison for elder abuse and exploitation cases. Cal listened as I spoke, his pen resting motionless above the page, as I explained how Claire had spoken of selling the house, how she whispered with a man named Vic, how Dr. Ellis's name came up, how she had already made a call pretending to be me. When I finished, he let out a quiet breath. "You have a strong foundation," he said. "What you need is protection before she moves further. We can file for a temporary restraining order on your assets. It would freeze any attempt to transfer or sell until a full hearing is held." I nodded slowly, clutching the strap of my bag. I asked how long it would take. He glanced at the clock and said if we filed today, the request could be reviewed within days, with a hearing set within weeks. Grace helped me fill out the petition. The language was formal, heavy with words like undue influence and financial exploitation. Each stroke of my pen felt like another brick laid in the wall I was building against her. I handed over copies of the tapes and the call log. Cal said they would be duplicated and sealed. My evidence was no longer just mine. It had become part of the record. When I stepped out of the courthouse, the air felt lighter, though the rain had not stopped. For the first time since that night, I heard Claire's laughter through the monitor. I felt a glimmer of safety. Not victory, not yet, but safety. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table while Daniel and Claire ate across from me. Daniel told her about a patient who had stood unaided for the first time. Claire clapped her hands and praised him, her smile wide. She turned to me, asking lightly if I had remembered to take my pills that morning. Her tone was sugary, but her eyes searched my face for cracks. I smiled faintly and said I had. Inside, I thought of the courthouse. I thought of Grace sliding the evidence into folders of Cal, saying the word protection. She had no idea her whispers now lived in a file with the county seal stamped across the top. 2 days later, I received a call from Grace. Her voice was firm this time. The judge had reviewed the petition. A temporary protective order was granted. A hearing was scheduled 6 weeks from now. My knees weakened as I thanked her. After we hung up, I pressed the phone to my chest. That night, I sat in my study, the order printed on crisp paper in front of me. The language was cold and official, but to me it read like oxygen. The house could not be sold. The deed could not be altered. No signatures could shift ownership until the court heard every word. I locked the document in my desk and leaned back in the chair. For weeks, I had felt like I was moving through shadows waiting for her to strike. Now, for the first time, I had light on my side. Claire still thought she was orchestrating everything, still whispering to Vic, still counting my staged mistakes. She had no idea the county now stood quietly between us. When I finally rose and turned off the lamp, the house felt different. Not safe, not yet, but stronger. The trap I had built within these walls had extended into the courthouse, into sealed folders and scheduled hearings. She thought I was fading. What she could not see was that I had already begun to fight back, and the law itself was listening. The following Monday began like any other, with the smell of coffee drifting through the kitchen and the steady patter of Seattle rain against the windows. I was wiping down the counter when the doorbell rang. Standing on the porch was a woman with a dark blue coat, a clipboard pressed against her chest, and eyes that studied me with gentle caution. She introduced herself as Miss Diaz from Adult Protective Services. Behind her, almost too conveniently, Claire stepped out from the living room with a startled gasp, her hand to her mouth as though she had not known this visit was coming. I could tell by the glint in her eyes that she had orchestrated the entire thing. I invited Miss Diaz inside, gesturing toward the living room where I had arranged fresh flowers in a vase. She sat in the armchair across from me, adjusting her glasses, while Claire perched on the edge of the sofa, pretending to look worried. The questions began simply enough. Could I tell her my full name, my date of birth, and the year? I answered clearly, steadying my voice so there was no tremor. Miss Diaz nodded, her pen scratching across the paper. Claire crossed one leg over the other and forced a small sigh, as if she expected me to stumble. Then came questions about my daily life. Did I cook for myself? Did I remember to take medications? Did I manage finances? I smiled politely and told her about the bills I paid each month, describing which utility companies served our neighborhood, and even the dates they typically processed checks. I explained how I tracked grocery spending in a notebook and how I kept a pill organizer in the kitchen drawer. Miss Diaz wrote quickly, listening closely. I noticed Claire's hand twitch slightly, her nails tapping against her knee. She tried to intervene. Sometimes she forgets the stove, Aunt Claire said in a voice dripping with false concern. Miss Diaz turned to me, her eyes kind but sharp. Is that true? I admitted there had been one incident when I let water boil too long, but I shut it off immediately and it had not happened again. I spoke evenly, making sure there was no defensiveness, only clarity. Claire's jaw tightened. The interview went on. Miss Diaz asked if I ever got lost driving, if I remembered recent events. I recounted the lemon cake recipe I had baked for Daniel's wedding step by step, down to the zest of the lemons I had grated by hand. I described in detail a trip I had taken to Pike Place Market with my neighbor Linda, even recalling the vendor's name who sold the best honey. My memory was not failing. My voice was steady. Claire's mask faltered for a split second, her lips pressed thin. Finally, Miss Diaz asked if I felt safe in my own home. I looked directly into her eyes and said yes. The silence stretched long enough that even the ticking of the mantel clock seemed louder. She closed her notebook with a soft snap and stood. She explained she had no reason to recommend guardianship at this time, but that APS would follow up periodically. Her smile was gentle, reassuring. Mine mirrored it, calm and unwavering. After the door closed, Claire lingered in the kitchen, slamming a cabinet harder than necessary. I pretended not to notice. Daniel came in from the backyard asking what had happened. Claire's voice brightened instantly. "Oh, just a routine check," she said, brushing it off with a laugh. I excused myself and went upstairs, my pulse still steady from the effort it had taken to stay so calm under her watchful eyes. That evening I wrote in my notebook, "APS visit, no findings." Bree visibly irritated. Daniel unaware. I underlined the entry twice. 2 days later, the phone rang while I was in the study. It was Cal. His tone carried a kind of restrained satisfaction. He told me that the Washington Real Estate Board had reviewed the complaint he filed on my behalf. Reed Allen, the agent Claire had contacted for the soft listing, had received a formal warning. They informed him that attempting to market or list a property without verified ownership documents could lead to license suspension. My breath left me in a rush I had not realized I was holding. I asked if Reed had denied it. Cal said the man had admitted Claire had approached him claiming she had power of attorney and that I was declining. The board reminded him such claims required legal proof. He had none, only her word. They placed the warning in his file. It was not enough to remove him from business entirely, but it was a bruise on his record, one that would follow him. That night at dinner, Daniel sat across from me speaking about a patient who had managed a new walking exercise. Claire smiled, nodding, but her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen and her expression shifted for the briefest moment, her smile thinning. She silenced it quickly, tucking it face down. I knew the warning had reached her. When Daniel excused himself to take a call from the clinic, Claire stood at the sink staring out the window. The overhead light cast her reflection sharp against the glass. I watched her grip the faucet, her knuckles pale. She was calculating, already thinking of her next move, but for the first time she had been struck not by me, but by someone else. Her ally was faltering. I finished clearing the plates without speaking, carrying them to the counter and rinsing them one by one. She turned, lips pressed tight, eyes burning with something she tried to hide. We locked gazes for a moment that stretched too long, then she looked away. Upstairs, I opened my notebook again. I added another entry. Real Estate Board warned Reed Allen. Not minor. Public record. Could rattle her confidence. My hand did not shake as I wrote. I closed the book, slid it into the drawer, and felt the weight of it, the growing arsenal of truths no one could take away. The house was quiet later that night, but not the same suffocating quiet I had felt weeks earlier. This was a charged silence, a pause before the next clash. I knew Claire would not let the setback rest. She was too invested, too deep into her scheme. Yet in the stillness, for the first time in months, I allowed myself the smallest breath of relief. I had stood face to face with her lies, answered every question clearly, and watched one of her partners be called to account. The storm was still gathering, but she was no longer the only one writing the story. Daniel spent the weekend restless, moving from room to room, as if the air inside the house had grown too. He fixed the squeaky hinge on the back door, tightened a loose handle on the dresser, even organized the tools in the garage, but his silence told me something had shifted. On Sunday night, while Claire scrolled on her phone at the dining table, I noticed him glance at her with a quiet sharpness I had not seen in years. It was the look of a man measuring distance, searching for what had been hidden in plain sight. Monday afternoon, he came home earlier than expected, his jacket damp from the drizzle. He went straight to the kitchen where one of the drawers had been sticking. I sat at the counter shelling peas while he pulled the drawer loose. The sound of wood scraping against metal filled the room until it gave way with a sudden pop. He laughed under his breath, shaking his head at the stubborn piece of furniture. Then his hand reached deeper into the cabinet where a thin accordion folder had been wedged behind the rail. He frowned, pulling it out, the word household written across the tab in Claire's careful handwriting. At first he flipped through quickly, expecting old warranties or bank statements. Then his movement slowed. He paused on a form with my name printed across the top. His face tightened as he traced a finger over a signature that looked like mine but was not. He pulled out another paper, a draft petition for guardianship already filled with details of incidents Claire had supposedly documented. Burned stove, misplaced sweater, forgotten dates. Each one matched the very things I had staged, except here they were twisted into accusations. Daniel set the papers on the counter, his shoulders stiff. His eyes lifted toward me and held there for a long time, searching. He did not speak. He gathered the folder, closed it carefully, and carried it upstairs. When he came back down, his jaw was clenched, and he said only that he would fix the drawer later. For the next few days, I saw the distance grow in his eyes each time Claire spoke. He noticed things now, small inconsistencies that once slipped past him. She said she had spent the afternoon visiting a friend, but her shoes were damp with rain, even though the day had been clear until evening. She told him she had called his clinic about a schedule change, but when he checked, no such call had been logged. He listened to her laugh at a story, then later asked about a detail she had forgotten she mentioned earlier. He was cataloging silently the way I had been doing for weeks. On Thursday, he stepped into my room after dinner holding a small shopping bag. He looked tired, but his eyes carried a clarity I had not seen in months. He sat on the edge of my bed and pulled out a slim digital recorder, a charger, and a sealed envelope. He handed me the device first, showing me how to switch it on, how to check the battery, how to save files. He said softly that he was sorry. Sorry for not seeing sooner. Sorry for letting her words weigh more than mine. He said he had believed the image she painted because it was easier than admitting he had been blind. I touched his hand and told him the past could not be changed, but the present was what mattered. The important thing was that he saw now. His shoulders dropped, and he let out a breath like he had been holding it for weeks. Then he opened the envelope and slid a document across my lap. It was an affidavit, freshly notarized, his signature crisp at the bottom. The words were stark, but powerful. He affirmed that I was of sound mind, that every decision about my property and finances was mine alone, and that he had not and would not support any guardianship claim filed without my consent. He declared he believed false information had been presented in his name and that he would testify if necessary. My vision blurred as I read the weight of those words, heavier than any paper I had ever held. He had chosen his side openly without hesitation. I whispered that I was proud of him, proud not for the paper, but for the strength it took to face what he had allowed to fester. The next evening at dinner, Claire asked brightly how his day had gone. He answered calmly, mentioning patients and paperwork. She asked why he had stopped by downtown that morning, her voice casual, but her eyes sharp. He told her it was work-related and changed the subject. She laughed, but it was hollow. Later, I heard her pacing upstairs, her steps sharp against the hardwood. She knew something had shifted. That weekend, Daniel began staying closer to me, lingering in the kitchen after meals, asking if I needed help with the garden, fixing things around the house he had long ignored. One night, he quietly suggested placing the new recorder in the living room bookshelf where Claire often took her phone calls. He stood on a chair adjusting the device until the small light blinked steady. He handed me the backup memory card and told me to keep it in my locked desk. For the first time since this nightmare began, I did not feel entirely alone. I had my son beside me, not just as the boy I had raised, but as a man finally seeing clearly. He was watching her now, not me, and the weight of her lies was beginning to press against her own chest. The following Monday, he asked if I was ready to take a drive downtown with him. We carried the affidavit, my notebook, and the recordings to Cal's office. He sat beside me in the waiting room, his hands folded tight in his lap. When Cal arrived, Daniel introduced himself and handed over the affidavit without waiting for me to speak. His voice was steady as he said he wanted the court to know the truth. On the ride home, we sat in silence, but it was a steady silence, not the heavy one that had haunted us for months. He drove with both hands on the wheel, his jaw relaxed. At one stoplight, he looked at me and said softly that he would not let her hurt me again. That night, I placed the affidavit in the binder with the rest of the evidence. I locked the drawer and felt the key cool against my palm. Daniel stood in the doorway watching, and I saw his father's steadiness in the way he nodded once before turning to bed. The house seemed lighter somehow, though nothing physical had changed. Claire still moved through the rooms with her perfume, and her clipped laughter still whispered into her phone late at night, but her steps carried less confidence. She had built her plan on the belief that Daniel would never question her. Now the cracks were spreading, and she could feel them under her feet. I lay awake listening to the sound of rain easing against the roof and thought of the affidavit of the small recorder blinking quietly in the bookshelf of my son, finally standing beside me. The game was no longer hers alone. Daniel spent the next 2 days moving around the house with a calm I had not seen in him for years. He no longer looked at Claire with blind trust. Instead, his eyes followed her the way a doctor might watch a patient measuring signs he had overlooked before. By Friday morning, he told me he wanted to cook dinner for the 3 of us. He said it lightly as if it were nothing more than a gesture of goodwill, but I could hear the firmness underneath. Claire raised an eyebrow when he suggested it, then smiled quickly and agreed. She liked control, but she liked appearances even more. The day was filled with quiet preparation. Daniel returned from the market with a paper bag of fresh rosemary chicken and vegetables. He moved through the kitchen with methodical ease, seasoning, chopping, arranging plates on the good china I had not seen in years. I watched him light candles and set them in the center of the table, his movement steady, deliberate. Claire came downstairs wearing a wine-colored blouse, her perfume trailing behind her. She paused when she saw the table, suspicion flickering in her eyes, but she slipped into her practiced smile and kissed him on the cheek. We sat down at 6 sharp. For the first half-hour, conversation was light, almost rehearsed. Claire chatted about a podcast. Daniel asked me about the garden, and I answered with calm politeness. The sound of forks against china filled the space. Claire laughed too often, as though she were trying to convince herself of the normalcy. I sat still waiting. Then Daniel set down his fork and reached into his jacket pocket. The room seemed to shift, the air thickening. He unfolded a sheet of paper and laid it neatly beside his plate. His voice was steady as he began to read. He listed the false forms, the fabricated incidents the call logs Claire had made in my name. He spoke of the soft listing Reed Allen had prepared now, under official warning from the real estate board. He mentioned the video Linda had captured on her Ring camera showing Claire slipping into my study at midnight. His words carried no anger, only certainty. Claire's smile faltered with the second point, her hand twitching slightly as she reached for her glass. By the fourth, her color drained. By the fifth, her fork clattered against her plate. She tried to interrupt, stammering about misunderstandings, but Daniel continued without raising his voice. When he finished, he folded the paper with precision and placed it in front of her. Silence stretched. I rose slowly and walked to the sideboard. From a drawer, I pulled 2 items, the original deed to the house with only my name and the temporary protective order issued by the court. I set them on the table between us. Claire's eyes darted across the pages, her breathing uneven. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. I told her calmly that this house was mine legally and beyond dispute. I said her whispers had become evidence sealed and stored in the courthouse. I told her the law had already recognized her scheme for what it was. The candle flames flickered, casting shadows across her pale face. For the first time, the mask she had worn slipped completely. She was no longer the charming wife or thoughtful daughter-in-law. She was cornered. Daniel leaned forward, his voice lower now. He told her plainly that he wanted her gone. He said he would not call the police that night, but if she remained past morning, he would. His words were not loud, but they carried the weight of finality. Claire's chair scraped hard against the floor as she stood. Her jaw tightened as though she were preparing to argue, but the fight in her eyes faltered when she looked again at the papers in front of her. For a moment, she seemed frozen, trapped between indignation and the reality she could not rewrite. Then, without another word, she turned and walked upstairs. We heard her footsteps pounding across the floor, the sound of drawers opening and closing, then the slam of a suitcase snapping shut. 20 minutes later, she came down her heels, clicking against the wood. She did not look at either of us. The front door opened, and the sound of her car pulling out of the driveway carried into the silence she left behind. Daniel exhaled, his shoulders lowering for the first time in months. He reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. His grip was firm, not desperate, but steady, and I felt a swell of relief I had not dared to imagine. The house was quiet, but not the heavy, suffocating quiet of the past weeks. It was the silence of release of something toxic finally leaving the air. I glanced at the papers still lying on the table, the deed and the order, and felt the solidity of them. They were not just documents. They were anchors, proof that I had not been erased. We did not speak for a long while. The candles burned lower, the chicken cooled on our plates, but we sat in that silence as though savoring the first true breath of peace. Finally, Daniel stood and cleared the table. He brought 2 cups of tea back and set one in front of me. We drank in quiet rhythm, no words needed. That night, as I climbed the stairs, I paused in the hallway. For the first time since the night I turned on the baby monitor, I felt the house itself ease, as though the walls had been waiting for this moment too. I closed my bedroom door and let myself rest, knowing the battle was far from finished, but also knowing that the tide had turned. The morning after the dinner felt unreal. The house seemed to exhale as though it too had been waiting for the moment. Claire's car was still in the driveway when I brewed my coffee, but the sound of footsteps, the clatter of dishes, the perfume trail that always followed her were absent. I sat at the kitchen table with my mug, staring at the quiet space where she usually scrolled on her phone. Daniel came down later, his hair uncombed, his face drawn, but firm. He said only that it was time for her to go. By mid-morning, the sound of a suitcase being dragged across the upstairs floor echoed through the house. Doors opened and shut drawers slammed. When she finally came down, Claire did not meet my eyes. She carried herself with stiffness, clutching her luggage as if it could shield her from the truth laid bare the night before. Daniel stood near the door arms, crossed his silence heavier than any words. She muttered something about staying with a friend, but even she seemed to know it was a lie. Moments later, the front door closed behind her and the tires of her car screeched faintly as she drove away. For the first time in months, the air in the house felt breathable. Yet I knew this was not the end. People like Claire rarely disappeared without a trace. That instinct was confirmed when later that week Daniel received word from a colleague at the courthouse that Claire's attorney had contacted the clerk. The message was simple: she would not pursue guardianship further. The evidence was too damning, the risks too high. Her lawyer had warned her that if she pressed forward, not only would she lose in court, but she might face criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy. The silence of her retreat spoke louder than any confrontation could have. Vic Turner, her secret confidant, seemed to vanish even faster. His phone was disconnected, his apartment emptied within days. A neighbor of his told Daniel that Vic had left town abruptly, muttering about opportunities elsewhere. I knew better. He was running from the trail of Claire's schemes. Justice began to ripple outward. Cal met me at his office the following week with an update. His expression carried quiet satisfaction as he explained that Dr. Ellis had been reported to the Washington Medical Board not just by me, but by others who had suspected his evaluations were less than ethical. A review was underway, and while it could take months, the odds of suspension were high. I pictured the man's polite but calculating smile, the way he had looked at me like a puzzle he was ready to solve with the stroke of a pen. The thought of him facing the consequences sent a warmth through me that coffee could not match. Reed Allen, the real estate agent Claire had tried to use, did not escape untouched either. The real estate board had issued a formal reprimand, and his license was now one misstep away from suspension. Word traveled quickly in our town, and soon colleagues would know him as the man who nearly lost his career over a fraudulent listing. Claire had dragged others into her scheme, and now they too were paying the price. When the court date arrived, Daniel and I drove downtown together. The leaves had turned copper and red, and the city streets shimmered with early sunlight. I carried my tote with the binder of evidence, though I knew now it was more symbol than necessity. Inside the hearing room, Judge Margaret Parker presided with the quiet authority of someone who had seen every kind of human conflict unfold before her bench. Cal presented our evidence with precision. He laid out the forged forms, the false reports, the recordings, the video footage, and Daniel's affidavit. He spoke clearly, leaving no room for doubt. Across the room, Claire's attorney sat stiffly, his client absent. He tried to frame the events as misunderstandings, but his words lacked conviction. Judge Parker's gaze did not soften. She asked pointed questions, her tone making clear she saw through the attempt. At the close of the hearing, she reaffirmed the protective order over my assets, dismissed the guardianship petition entirely, and instructed that all records reflect my sole ownership of the property. Her gavel struck once, the sound echoing like a final door slamming shut. Daniel touched my arm gently as we rose. We walked together through the marble halls of the courthouse. The air outside was crisp, the chatter of the city filling my ears after the hushed formality of the courtroom. I paused on the courthouse steps and drew a deep breath, one that felt fuller than any I had taken in months. The weight pressing on my chest since the night I first overheard Claire's whispers finally lifted. I looked at Daniel and he at me. We did not need words. We both knew the storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet but undeniable truth. Justice had taken its course not in a loud explosion, but in steady steps that could not be undone. Claire was gone, Vic had fled Ellis, and Reed were under scrutiny, and the house was mine in both law and spirit. As the breeze rustled through the trees along the courthouse plaza, I closed my eyes for a moment. The fight was over, and though scars remained, I had emerged intact. When I opened them again, the world looked sharper, lighter. I stepped forward with Daniel at my side, ready to return home not as a woman under siege, but as a woman restored. The drive back from the courthouse was quiet, but it was not the suffocating silence that had haunted me for months. This was a softer stillness, the kind that follows resolution. Daniel kept both hands on the wheel, his gaze steady on the winding road that led us home. I rested my hand on the armrest and let the autumn light wash across my face. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt my breath move easily, unforced. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked unchanged from the outside. The ivy still crept along the stone walls, the shutters needed paint. The porch leaned slightly to one side. Yet I saw it differently. It was no longer a place under siege, but a fortress reclaimed. I carried my tote bag inside and set it on the hall table without hesitation. There was no need to hide the evidence binder anymore. Its job was done. The following morning, I moved through the house, slowly touching things as if to remind myself they were truly mine. In the living room, the sheer curtains Claire had chosen still hung across the windows, pale and cold. Daniel helped me take them down. Together we hung the old blue floral drapes I had folded away months earlier. When the fabric fell into place, the room softened instantly, light filtering through in the same way it had when Daniel was a boy playing with blocks on the rug. One by one we returned what had been erased. The photograph of Daniel at 5 years old, holding a stick like a sword with his father laughing behind him, went back on the mantel. The fringed lamp with its warm golden glow returned to its corner. My grandmother's candlesticks, once boxed away, stood proudly near the fireplace. I could almost hear echoes of laughter that had been silenced during Claire's stay. In the afternoons, Daniel worked with me outside. We pulled weeds that had crept along the flower beds and planted rows of marigolds, roses, and lavender. The soil clung to our hands, and the air smelled fresh, alive. As we worked, Daniel apologized again. His voice broke when he said he had allowed blindness to come between us. I stopped him, touching his arm. I told him what mattered was that he saw the truth now, and he was here. His shoulders eased and he nodded, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. One evening, as twilight deepened, I found the bread tin tucked away in the closet. Inside were the cassette tapes Daniel had recorded as a child, each labeled in his small handwriting. I carried them to the living room and slid one into the old player. The tape hissed before filling the room with the shaky notes of piano keys, followed by his young laughter. Daniel sat beside me on the couch, listening intently. When his child's voice sang off-key, he covered his face and laughed, though tears glistened in his eyes. I laughed too, though my chest ached with memory. We sat like that for an hour, listening, letting the past stitch itself gently back into the present. As the weeks passed, the house seemed to change with us. No longer tense and watchful, it became warm again. The echoes of betrayal were replaced by the steady rhythm of ordinary life. Meals shared at the table felt simple and honest. Even the creaks in the floorboards sounded less ominous, as if the house itself was lighter. Daniel often joined me on the porch in the evenings. We sipped tea as the sun slipped behind the trees. One night he said he wished his father could see us now. I told him I believed he could in the resilience that carried us through. The silence between us was no longer a wall, but a comfort. I often thought back to the night I first turned on that old baby monitor. It had been nothing more than a relic from Daniel's childhood tucked away and nearly forgotten. Yet it became the witness that set everything in motion, carrying me from whispers in the dark to the bright lights of a courtroom. That device, small and unremarkable, reminded me that no matter how carefully someone tries to erase you, the truth finds a way to endure. Now, when I walk through these rooms, I see more than furniture and walls. I see memory persistence and a voice that refused to be silenced. I see a son who finally stood beside his mother, not as a child needing guidance, but as a man who found clarity. I see a life reclaimed not through rage, but through steady steps and quiet strength. The law had protected me, but it was love that restored me. My house was secure, my name was intact, and my story was mine again. From that baby monitor to the courtroom, I stopped a $7 million plot to steal my home. But in truth, I kept more than the house. I held on to my voice, my history, and the value of who I am. If you have ever been doubted, dismissed, or made to feel invisible, let my story remind you of this. Justice may arrive quietly, but it will arrive. Healing may take time, but it will come. And if you have lived through something similar, if you too have carried a weight that no one else could see, share your story. Someone out there needs to hear it, just as I once needed to know I was not alone.